Tonight we're going to take it a little bit further. And I hope you appreciate that I can only say so much within an hour. I can't say everything I don't mean. I can just say what I mean in this section. And so even tonight, I think I'm going to leave you with more questions than answers. But you know, if I think, in my experience of God, you know, we've always wanted God to be the answer to all our questions. And I have found him over and over again to be the question to all my answers. He's the one that continually comes and says, really? Is that what you believe about me? Really? How did you get to that conclusion? And so God is much more the one who stirs up questions. Why? Because he's the God of infinite possibilities. And questions have got many possibilities. But answers are very restricted. Answers are very narrow. Sometimes our answers are so small that they get boring very quickly. And God is definitely not boring. And so obviously he comes and gives us a sense of security, a sense of truth. The true pursuit of truth is going to not make you have a doctrine of truth. A true pursuit of truth is going to make you true. It's something that transforms you. It's something that makes you honest. It's a true pursuit of truth is like a shadow embracing the sun. It disappears in the process. And that means that who we thought we are, who we thought God is, who everything we thought is stable disappears in this act of embracing God. And we lose ourselves to find ourselves. And we die so that we can live. And we disappear so that the true self can be revealed again. And so I'm not using this last session to try and answer all the questions that I've stirred up in the previous two sessions. I'm using this session to make sure you got what the questions are and leaving you with one or two more questions so that you've got something to do for the rest of this year. It's figuring out those questions. I'm so blessed last night we went out with a few friends and two or three of them said, you know, you just last year when we were here, just completely wrecked our theology. That is such a compliment. Because God has never submitted himself to our understanding of him. He continues to reveal to us that, hey, every attempt that you have of describing me, that's great. And we continually try and describe God more accurately. There's nothing wrong with trying to get a hold of this beautiful truth, but the more beautiful truth is something and someone got a hold of us. And how to describe this truth. We realize that language has got finds its greatest fulfillment when it points to a beauty beyond itself, a beauty that language cannot contain. And language finds its greatest perversion when it claims to possess this beauty. When we claim that my dogma, my way of describing God is the way, that is when language becomes perverted. No, it's beautiful to realize that even the scriptures points to a reality beyond itself. This is why the Word of God became not a book, not a doctrine, but the Word became flesh. Because this truth, its ultimate destiny is to be expressed in human life. So that's kind of a summary of what we did Sunday morning, is to make sure that we understand that our descriptions of truth is all exciting. It's great to pursue this truth, but never confuse your descriptions of truth with truth himself. The truth himself continues to be astoundingly, surprisingly beyond our ability to control and to our ability to box in. Now, this truth remains a beauty that draws us to a place where we explore him beyond where we've explored him so far. And so last night we started looking at desire. We started looking at the formation of self. And one of the first things we explored is the reflective nature of man. We looked at how from every angle, whether we start from neurology or psychology or any other angle, human beings are made to reflect. And the quality that we reflect most unconsciously and from the earliest age is we reflect the desires of others who are like us. So when we recognize likeness, there's already something within us that starts mirroring the intentions and the desires of this other who is like us. And that is how desire begins this cycle of reflection within human societies, within us as individual human beings growing up. And we started going into Genesis, showing how this same concept of man being a reflective being was an ancient intuition, that man recognized our ability to reflect, and ultimately the highest aim of this capacity is to be a reflection of God himself. And so in this way, the Genesis account was a radically irreligious text, because in the environment and in the literary history in which it was written, it was completely the inverse of what was being portrayed as who God is and who man is. In the mythology of that day, man was just an afterthought. And the gods who continually were busy with all kinds of squabbles, all kinds of unjust and jealousy and fighting in between them, with every now and then, their wars would overflow in the destruction of humanity. And whether it was a flood, a pestilence, a war, evil could easily be explained by simply saying the gods, who doesn't care about humanity, is who causes all this evil. So the problem of evil was quite quickly and easily explained. Now, if we worship our God in our tribe and something evil happens, there's only one of two reasons. Either we haven't done the right sacrifices to appease our God, or it's another God from another tribe that is attacking our God. And so evil was always just the doing of the gods. Because man from the very beginning could not bear to see evil in himself and continue to project it onto whatever else it could find. That's the problem of our society and the problem of what causes the destruction here. And so the Genesis account was the most irreligious because it came to set people free from their religious superstitions by saying, no, there is just one God without competition. He's not involved in any kind of warfare or fight with his brothers or with other gods. He is beyond compare, beyond competition. And by the way, everything he does is good. The water is good, the earth is good, the plants are good, the animals are good. You are very good. And so this begins to set people free from their fearful anxiety of unjust gods who are out to get us. And so you can imagine it wasn't very popular in many regions where this was starting to be proclaimed, because all the doctors who were selling their incantations would no longer sell incantations to people who believed in a God who's only good. And so this brought the instability to their society and to their economy and to their religious hierarchy. And one of the first things that happens after people started hearing this story, that God is not to be feared, that God is not evil, he's only good, the next question was, well, where does evil come from then? What is the source of the problems and the suffering and the pain we are dealing with? And ultimately, the highest manifestation of evil for them was death. And death was much more in your face in those days. Today, we outsource the whole process. We just hear of somebody dying. We don't want to see it. We don't want to touch it. We don't want to deal with it. Just outsource it, and then that's the end of it. But if you lived in that community, death was an in-your-face reality. I think the average age was less than 30. Okay, it was somewhere in your 20s was the average age. Because if it wasn't the incurable plague, it was the tribe next door that came and violently take your land. If it wasn't that, it was natural disaster against whom we had no technology or resources like we had today to fight it. So death was an in-your-face reality. And death asks the ultimate question of people, and that is, has your life had any meaning? Does anything have any meaning? When you're constantly faced with death, these questions constantly rise. And so many stories were written in which people started imagining a way of escaping the most obvious manifestation of evil, and that is death. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh, of which we have copies that are thousands of years before Christ, tells a story of people living in a garden and basically the whole pursuit of a tree of life. And variations of this story has been used in different mythology, where people were in pursuit of a tree of life. Why? Because if we can just get, you remember the mythology, the myth we spoke about yesterday about the primordial waters in which Apsu and Tiamat commingled their waters and produced all the other gods. Now, that kind of otherworldly element that gave birth to the gods gave people the idea that if we can just get a hold of that substance from which the gods themselves have their origin, then maybe we can overcome these gods and even cheat death. And so there came an obsession with the tree of life. Many of the stories have this obsession of a pursuit of some way in which we can live forever and cheat death. And so the writer of Genesis 2 and 3, let's first go to Genesis 2. Remember, in Genesis 1, God introduces differences. He introduces the difference between day and night, between light and darkness, between water and dry land. Every step of creation is another step of differentiation. And this is important because in the mythology that they were used to, the only way in which we deal with difference is eliminate the one who is different. Violence is the thing that difference is just a space of enmity. But here the picture starts showing us that distance is not necessarily evil. Difference becomes an opportunity, a space of reconciliation. It becomes a space in which friendship can take place. So God creates order by creating more and more differentiation. And in Genesis 2, He creates another very important difference, the difference between what is life-giving and what is death-producing. And the writer starts saying God planted another tree, the tree of life. Now, at this stage, the community many of them would have been familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh story or a similar story, their ears prick up because we've heard this story before, just like we heard the first story of chaos and water and Tiamat and wind and bringing order out of chaos. They heard that story before, but the Genesis one had a twist on that story. And now the writer's starting to tell another story, but he's going to bring another twist to this story as well, because yes, there is a tree of life, but God also planted another tree. Huh? We've never heard of another tree. There's no record in mythology of any story that tells of a different tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, like the scriptures does. And it's almost like the writer wants to just draw their attention with the tree of life, and then for the rest of the story, he kind of ignores the tree of life and speaks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He's busy proposing a different understanding of where evil comes from and how we're going to overcome this evil. And so the last portion of Genesis 2, he speaks about Adam and Eve were both naked, and he uses the word aram, but they were unashamed. And then in the next verse, in chapter 3, he says, now the snake was more aram than all the creatures God made. Now, then we translate that word aram as shrewd or wise. So why does it mean naked in the one sense, but wise or shrewd in another sense? Well, maybe this gives us some insight. In Genesis 49, Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies who came into the land to spy out the nakedness of our borders. What is aram of our borders? What does he mean by the nakedness of our borders? It's where are our borders vulnerable to penetration. That is what it means. So you can see that, yes, maybe the better translation is Adam and Eve were both vulnerable, but naked is a good word as well, because when you're naked, you're vulnerable. Okay, and just like the borders. And so here we've got the the nakedness, man and his wife were both naked, but they were unashamed. Why? Because they have never used their vulnerability to harm one another. Vulnerability was just an opportunity for intimacy. And now it goes into Genesis 3, and we are presented with a picture, an image of a twisted creature that's going to exploit this vulnerability. He's more vulnerable than any other creature. And all the words used in chapter 3, all the phrases are phrases that awakens desire. The fruit was pleasant to the eyes. It was desirable to make one wise. It was, all these words are words that plays on mankind's desire. To eat speaks about your appetite. Desire. This whole tree speaks of desire. And so the snake asks the question and says, well, did God say that you shouldn't eat of the fruit of this tree? And Eve answers and says, we shouldn't even touch it, which is kind of an exaggeration of what God said. He kind of never said that. He just said, don't eat it. But it kind of betrays the underlying nervousness. When mankind starts perceiving God as a threat, the one from whom even death comes, then this nervousness begins, and we shouldn't even touch it. And so the snake speaks back and says, well, you won't die. I mean, the only reason God is withholding this fruit is because he does not want you to be like him. Remember Genesis 1:26. God gives his own image and likeness freely to man. He doesn't withhold himself. He doesn't withhold anything. In Genesis 1, he is the self-giving God who desires us, gives himself to us. By that act, awaken our desire for him. Now the suggestion is made in Genesis 3 that God is actually withholding his own image and likeness. And this is why he doesn't want you to eat of this tree, because he doesn't want you to be like him. Now, what happens to a reflective being if you think God wants that tree more than any other tree? That tree becomes more desirable than any other tree. Wow, if that is the tree that makes God God, and he wants it for himself, and he doesn't want me to have it, I'm going to get it. And I'm going to be like God without God. You see, this is can you see what happens, the clever twist of desire? In the Genesis 1 account, there aren't three objects of desire. There is only God and man reflecting one another. Now in Genesis 3, the suggestion is made, you lack being. And so when that sense of lack is awakened, you think, how do I satisfy this? And the solution is there. Just eat of this fruit. So a third object is being introduced, an object that you can now focus your desire on, in the belief that if only I get a hold of that, my lack of being will be satisfied and I will be like God. And what happens when this triangle of desire is created? You become the rival of God, and God becomes your rival for this fruit. God doesn't want you to have this tree, this fruit, because he doesn't want you to be like him. Well, then God is in rivalry with me, because I lack being. I'm going to pursue this fruit and make myself like God without God. And it's interesting that how desire becomes twisted, and the very quality that makes us most like God becomes the quality that makes us most unlike Him in rivalry. Let me give a very practical example. You can imagine two young boys growing up and enjoying the same kind of activities. Both love fishing, both love sport, and they don't even realize it, but their desires have been reinforcing one another's desires. And that's the way friendship works. We reflect one another's intentions and desires. It's good, and that is what made that beautiful friendship possible. But then maybe in college, they suddenly both notice the same girl. Now this reflective quality is no longer fun. Now it becomes rivalry. And so the very quality that made them best of friends can make them worst of enemies. Can you see that? How desire reflected is a good thing, except when it spills over into the kind of rivalry where you want to replace the other. Because you see, the problem is not really just that the fruit is very nice and pleasant. What you really want is to restore your sense of being. And so when people enter into rivalistic relationships with one another, the object over which the rivalry is happening becomes less and less important. Because deep, in a way, you sense that you're blind to it, but you think that just owning this thing is going to give you greater being. But what you actually want to do is replace the being of your rival. That's why all early laws, including the Genesis laws, are laws to limit violence and rivalry. So let me give you a quick example. Let's take the 10 commandments from Commandment 6 to 10. Commandment 6, you shall not murder. This is the ultimate evil result of rivalry, would be murder. And Commandment 7, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness. It's like the writer realizes, I can go on and on and on and on. Should not do. Let me get back to the root problem, and Commandment 10 gives us that commandment. Do not desire what is your neighbor's. I think we must call this message, do not desire your neighbor's ass. That is the old King James version of the 10th commandment. The New King James says, your neighbor's donkey. But I like the old King James. I think that was much more accurate. Okay. So in the last commandment, he comes right down to what is it that caused all this conflict. Is you've allowed the desire of others to stir up your desire in such a way that you enter into a rivalistic relationship with them. And you're starting to scheme, to deal deceitfully. And because you are a reflective being, you've got the suspicion that if I'm making all kinds of schemes to get the same thing, I'm sure they're making schemes, and very soon the confirmation comes. And if you live in a society where there aren't very well-developed laws and governments to control violence, what is the next thing? If I can't just get it through scheming, I'm just going to take it. You shall not steal. But even just getting what belongs to your neighbor does not satisfy, because it was never about the object. It was about the sense of lack of being. So what you want to do is take what is most precious to your rival. Do not commit adultery. But even that does not satisfy. And so the ultimate place, the rival. This is going off every night. Is it all right? The ultimate attempt to replace the rival is murder. And so the first 10 chapters of Genesis, 10, 11 chapters, starts showing us that the main problem that originates in our primordial past is the problem of violence. The theological child of Adam and Eve is the first murderer, is the first one who takes the life of his brother. And by the way, that reveals that all murder is fratricide, which is the murder of a brother. It's the murder of somebody that's part of your family and is unjustified. And so as it continues, the only way in which man initially imagines how can we deal with the problem of violence is to suggest that maybe we can stop man being violent by promising overwhelming retribution. And so the promise is made to Cain that if anyone hurts Cain or murders him, he will be avenged 7 times. Later on, Lamech, one of Cain's descendants, come along, and he said, a young man struck me and I murdered him. I killed him. And if Cain was avenged 7 times, I will be avenged 70 times 7. Can you see that the problem with violence is it always escalates? It never just stays on one level. You kill one of our tribe, we'll kill 5 of yours. How long do we have to be trapped in this cycle of violence before we're going to realize that? And so eventually we come to Noah, which totally articulates the original problem in these words. The desires of man's heart was evil continually. And what is the result of that? And violence filled the earth. So this is the problem that Jesus is going to come and deal with. The problem where he's going to come and expose that our violence is our own. Because what we did is we just projected our violence onto God again. It's God that commands the victims. It's God that commands the blood. It's God that commands revenge. But that process is going to be slowly undone. Let me go back to the tree. So where we've developed from yesterday is we looked at how man tried to make sense of this world. We saw that man quite easily explained evil through the theory of the existence of many gods that have fights, and therefore we just suffer the consequences. The Genesis account overturns that and says, no, there is one God without competition, and this God is only good, and everything he does is good. Then the next question that rises up is, well, what the heck is going on in this world? If God is only good and all he does is good, then where does the evil come from? And remember, when these accounts were written, there were no concept whatsoever of Satan. That concept develops much, much later. The concept we've attached the figure of Satan to the figure of the snake, and the Genesis account being specifically subversive of mythology says, the snake, it was just another creature of God. He's not in competition with God. This is God's making. And even this, what God made, is good. Okay, so it's subverting their religious ideas, and the picture it's starting to bring through, which is a shocking revelation, is that evil would have no place in this world if people, if humanity did not partake of a perverted desire and a perverted knowledge of good and evil. It's the moment in which we misconceived God as one who withholds that was the beginning of us being a reflection of the God of our own confusion. So the moment we misconceive this God, being reflective beings, we're going to continue reflecting. And when we stop reflecting the God who gives himself, who adores us, who trusts us, who loves us, what happens? Adoration turns into accusation. Trust turns into suspicion. Reflecting the self-giving nature of God is replaced by the same insecure, withholding, get all you can and protect it attitude. Compete with everyone who wants to touch what is mine. And so this kind of perverted image of God reflected in man is the origin of evil. Now the story develops obviously throughout the New Testament, Old Testament and New Testament, and as I said, I can only say so much now. But in the new book that's coming out it's probably January, there will be a chapter on the history of Satan. It is a concept that has developed over many centuries, and the whole mystery of evil and how Jesus comes to expose what evil really is, again in the cross, is a whole chapter of its own. The purpose of tonight, though, is to bring us to this very clear picture that can you see how the reflective nature of man is the capacity that can make us most like God, but it is also the capacity that can make us most unlike him. Now, we've going and traveling and ministering as we do, we often face this question: is man by nature sinful, or is man by nature good? And what we've concluded is man is by nature free to be whatever you behold. Man can be as good or as evil as the God you perceive. And so in Jesus Christ, God brings us again face to face with the only God who doesn't suffer from multiple personality disorder. Because what we have done from that moment onwards is even every attempt of God to reveal himself, the God whose mercies are new every morning, the God who is consistent. We've taken that self-revelation, but as soon as a disaster struck, oh my goodness, God must have been mad. And what we've done is we've taken God's self-revelation and mixed it up with our own projections of our own fear and our own anxiety, our own sense of lack of being. And so you have this conversation happening throughout the ages and throughout the scriptures of God beginning to reveal himself, but man kind of swaying to and fro. Yes, we want to believe it, but no. Things are too bad to believe you are that good. And no, God is good, but we still fear him. And in Jesus, God comes and says, he is the exact representation of my character and my person. And this Jesus will rather suffer your violence than partake of your violence. This Jesus will rather suffer your injustice than enforce your idea of justice upon you. The God revealed in Jesus will rather go to hell than abandon you there. He's the God that enters into our deepest confusion, our deepest alienation, our deepest doubt, and says, I am only for you. I am not your problem. Your violence has been your own. I come to liberate you from your own illusions about who I am. See, so often we have the idea that God and man, God was terribly offended at man's sin, and so he separates himself from man. So how dare he eat that fruit? I told him not to. I just, in that picture, I just wish God made the fruit ugly. Make it Brussels sprouts or something like that. Put it high up in a mountain, inaccessible, but no, this fruit is desirable, and it's there right in the middle of the garden. There's so many things wrong with that picture. But in any case, we have this idea that the problem with sin is God just got terribly offended with man, and that is what makes sin so bad. It offends God. And God was so offended that he can no longer fellowship with us because he's too holy to come near sin. And so he separates himself from us until we sort this problem out. And so throughout the Old Testament, God tries to re-educate us, and he gives us laws and ways and teachings for us to behave better again. But man continually fails to get there. So imagine there's God and there's mankind. And so Jesus, knowing his Father, maybe can I get you two girls to please come up here quickly? It just works better with a demonstration. Can you stand there? You stand there. So throughout the Old Testament, we imagine that God gets ever more upset with humanity, trying to teach them and trying to tell them how to behave correctly. But you can see it. She's going to mess up again. And man continues to kind of mess up. And Jesus, looking at his Father, knowing his Father, seeing, oh my goodness, my Father's getting ready to beat somebody to death. And so Jesus, being the kind part of God, steps into the gap and says, Father, you can beat me up instead of mankind. Now that is what we typically call the satisfaction theory. And we use much more legalistic, beautiful, theoretical terms like God's justice had to be satisfied. But if we get right down to the bottom line of what satisfied God, it was the brutal murder and death and blood and guts of that cross that is seen as something so delightful to God, that he can now again be kind to us. Can you see that there's something very wrong in that picture? Even the theologians who are totally committed to that idea of atonement, the honest ones will admit this, that if you deconstruct that message to its basic statement, it says this: Jesus came to save us from the Father. That the Father has been our problem all along. But hey, thankfully there was still a bit of love somewhere, and Jesus, being the manifestation of that love, comes to save us from the wrath and the anger of his God. Thank you, guys. Now, Jesus isn't a third party in between God and man. Jesus is fully God and fully man. In his person, God and man is reconciled and united once again. Jesus as God is the perfect revelation of who God is. But Jesus, as well as perfectly human, is the perfect response of faith to God's self-revelation. Jesus is not just God's initiative. Jesus is also man's response. He is a perfect salvation, a perfect reconciliation between God and man. And he invites us into this knowledge. What he comes to reveal upon that cross, even as we are nailing him to that cross, he says, Father, forgive them. In other words, if when we are at our worst, murdering the one who has only ever loved us and sustained us, when we are at our worst, he still forgives. That's got to bring this one message home. God is not our problem. We can no longer project our fears and our anxieties and our blame upon God's justice. Oh, this is exciting. So, if God is not our problem, and in the resurrection, Jesus reveals that our conveniently chosen scapegoats are innocent. See, we've projected that blame as well. It must be the guilty scapegoats that makes the gods angry. So if we can just kill the right people, then God will be happy and we'll all live in peace. And so through the resurrection, and by the way, every time the apostles speak about the death and resurrection of Christ, they make it clear. His death is something man did. His resurrection is what God did. This Jesus whom you murdered, God raised him up. This Jesus whom you crucified, God made him alive. God is not the author of the violence and the brutality of the cross. He's the one who, in spite of our violence, reverses it in the resurrection and says, your worst evil will not change me. I will continue to be the one who offers forgiveness. You see, since the blood of Abel, this is what Jesus says in Matthew 23, I've come to reveal things hidden since the foundation of this world, from the blood of the righteous Abel until the priest that they killed in the temple. The blood of all those innocent victims is going to come upon this generation, and he speaks about his own death as not a unique occurrence, but as part of a pattern that has happened over and over and over in history, where we find somebody else on which to project our own evil and blame them and eliminate them. But what makes the blood of Jesus so powerful, according to Hebrews 12, is that it speaks of better things than the blood of Abel. The blood of all the innocent victims throughout history called for vengeance. Because the only justice we have imagined on our own level, humanity have engineered, is retributive justice. Give people what they deserve. And so the blood of all the innocent victims call for vengeance. What makes the blood of Jesus so powerful is its message. It calls for forgiveness. It says, despite your greatest evil, despite your deepest confusion, in which you would even murder your own maker and then and then blame me for murdering myself. Even that confusion. As you see, that is just another attempt in which we say, hey, this was all God's idea. It's just another way of scapegoating us. God even. I mean, his crucifixion, we had nothing to do with it, did we? This was all God's idea. No, God knew, obviously, that was going to happen. He willingly gives himself to this. But the thing that God crucifies on that cross is not his son. Colossians 2 tells us that he crucifies the very law of retribution, the commandments that were against us. You see, we thought that the cross is God fulfilling the law in terms of finally God submits himself to the law and he says the wages of sin is death, and so I must have a death to pay for the sin. No, how God fulfills the law is by annihilating it. It's by saying this very law that says you must get what you deserve is the law that in this act I nailed to that cross. And I say, now that we are all absolutely plain, you have murdered your very maker. What do you deserve? We all know. Death, damnation, distraction. But in your worst evil, I give you forgiveness. I give you love. I want you to see that I'm not subject to your laws of retribution, to your system of justice. And so God comes to set us free from our own illusions. What separated us from God? Sin is, according to Colossians 1:21, enmity in our own minds. We separated ourselves from the true God when we misinterpreted him. And by misinterpreting him, we became the reflection of the God of our own confusion. And so we separated ourselves even from our true selves. Because our true selves is a reflection of the self-giving God. And so as we separated ourselves from our true selves and the true God, God remained the one who sustained us in existence. God remained the one who made every atom in your body vibrate with energy. He's the one who even gave you the time, the energy to sin with. This is why he can keep you accountable for it. See, God is against sin, not because he's just a prude who doesn't want you to have fun. God's against sin because he doesn't like stuff that kills you. He loves you. He likes you. And so the stuff that's destructive, he's against that. But the destructive stuff doesn't start with actions. It starts with a wrong reflection that leads to wrong beliefs and suspicions and accusation that leads to a wrong lifestyle. In him all things consist. That's why we read in the New Testament that God comes to reconcile man to himself, not himself to man, because God has never left. God is the one who has suffered in the victim and was tormented in the perpetrator of evil. He's the one who both suffered in the one who was nailing him to the cross and the one who suffered the consequences of that nailing. He's the God who comes to demonstrate, I will rather suffer the consequences of your confusion with you than leave you in your confusion. And so 1 John 5:20, he comes to give us understanding, that we may know him who is true, and we are in him who is true. We discover our true selves again in the reflection of the true God. And the true God is consistently, absolutely, continually only love. And there is no fear in love. He's not double-faced. He's not double-standard. He's just for you. Ooh, what a fun gospel. Now, there's so much more to be said, but my goodness, we might have to stop somewhere. Mary Ann, don't you want to come up? I'm sure I stirred maybe a bit more questions, but maybe I'll just take a chance and say, is there one or two burning questions that anybody want to ask me? And maybe we'll just make space for one or two of that. Yes, my brother.
I'm listening to you, but what you're basically telling me is that I'm free from that identity that I've been walking around with all these years. That really means that I am in Christ, I've been in Christ. The person that I've been betraying all these years, that was not me. That was not the actual me, that was the illusion.
Yeah.
God was me, but I'm actually a God man, and I've been a God man all my life. I just didn't know.
Very good statement and question. So I'm going to rephrase it. So, and correct me if I understand this wrongly, but many of us have walked, and many people today walk in great confusion. They live a life that is destructive, that is in any way that we can call it is sinful, is not right. Now, is that an illusion? Is that a false self? Now, first of all, let's quickly just deal with the word illusion. Illusion doesn't mean something's not real. In other words, if I tell my children, when they were little, don't go in the kitchen, I'm going to go to town, but don't go in the kitchen, there's a big vicious dog that will bite you. Stay out of the kitchen while I'm gone. And for some reason, I get delayed in town and I don't come back for hours, and they become very hungry. But they fear too much to go into the kitchen and get themselves food. Their hunger is real. But their experience of hunger is based on a lie, an illusion that there is a vicious dog in the kitchen. So, first of all, let me make this clear, that our illusions leads to very real experiences and very real action. So there are people that really does evil things, people that really partake in horrible lifestyle, however we want to term that. The question is that their true self or not their true self? And maybe the best is to go to James 1 from verse 25, and it says this: whenever this word is preached, it is like a man that sees the face of his birth, of his genesis, is the Greek, the face of his origin, as in a mirror. Now, you've got two choices. One man looks at it and goes away and forget, because if you don't look deeply, it's so easy to fall into the thought patterns and the habits and the lifestyle that you've grown up with. So he looks, but he forgets, and he returns to the lifestyle that he was involved in. And it speaks about that man not being a doer of the word. But then there's a man who looks, and he becomes mesmerized with what he sees. He becomes captivated with a new image of himself. And he says, that guy that did all that nonsense, that's not me. This is the face of my birth. This is what God sees in me. And by looking into the perfect law of liberty and continuing to look, his actions begins to conform to what God saw about him all along. Now, obviously, there's a big difference. I remember there were times in my life where I said, God, everything in my experience contradicts what I see in Jesus. I mean, and every time I would go to God and say, how do we deal with this problem and these contradictions? And he would say, go look into the mirror. And I didn't want to hear that. I wanted him to say, man, Andre, your problem's so unique. I'm going to give you the secret 3 steps of how to get out of this. But every time he just said, go look back into that mirror. I would say, but 2 Corinthians 3:18, we behold Jesus as in a mirror. I say, but you want me to focus on Jesus and believe that he's a reflection of me and I'm a reflection of him? But he's perfect. I mean, he's joyful. He's all these things. I know myself. That's not me. It's not me. And so I'd argue, and the Lord would say, just keep on looking. I would say, well, maybe if you had 10 or 20 years, or maybe one day in heaven, if you've had a long time to work on me, maybe I can resemble something like Jesus. And the Lord would say, keep on looking, because a mirror does not reveal tomorrow. It does not reveal yesterday. This mirror reveals what I know to be true about you right now. You keep on looking until one of us changes our minds. And so eventually, I started saying, despite the contradiction, despite, many arguments, I'm going to come to this simple conclusion, that God is finding expression and existence in my person. And as I continue to behold the self-giving love I see in Jesus, it's not an effort. When I continue to believe that he is an example of me, and not just for me, something begins to happen in my experience. So what I can say is that there is not one person on this planet alive today who is sustained in existence by any other force but God himself. There's not one atom that spins that God is not spinning. He is the one and only creator. Now, obviously, we can choose to model this God, like in John 8, or Jesus says, or you can choose to model, you are of your father, you are modeling the accuser, who was a murderer from the beginning. We are very capable of reflecting evil or the perversion of what we perceive in God. And he was a murderer from the beginning, never stood in the truth. So what God is saying there is not, I have an enemy who is equal to myself in terms of he's able to create and have offspring called the children of the devil. That is not what Jesus is saying. There is only one creator. If you read throughout the book of John, nothing was made except by him, and nothing continues to exist except through him. He's the only true creator, the only true origin of all of mankind. But he does give us the freedom to reflect and image whatever we want to. And so in that way, we do sometimes partake in a lifestyle that is the complete opposite of what God intended. And I can say boldly that that is not the true you. So, last example. What happens in the prodigal son is he's sitting amongst the pigs. He stinks. He's done everything wrong. What changes his mind to go back to the Father? Is it somebody that comes to him and say, boy, you stink. You look like the pigs. You smell like the pigs. You are a pig. But I'm going to give you an opportunity to become a servant again. No, Luke 15 is so beautiful. It says, he remembered the Father. And he came to himself. He saw the face of his birth again. The face of his Genesis, and he was thinking, what the heck am I doing in the pigsty? This is not me. I mean, my Father has got servants, and he's got this farm, and so it is the revelation of his true self, the reminder that your lifestyle, what you're doing, where you're at, is not really you. And to remind people of their papa, saying, hey, remember your Father. Remember the self-giving love that birthed you and brought you into existence. And that is what causes him to run back to the Father. Hope that helps a bit for you. Thank you. Thank you, Mother.